Real tough activism is about humbling ourselves and building the bridges to the people that are not with us, the people who voted for Trump, the people who voted for Brexit, and all of those things. And we must believe that the vision and the alternative society that we are advocating is one that is so patently just and defendable. We must believe that we can win over people who have been lied to, misled, and terrified by some of the changes that critically the science tells us we need to make in terms of changing our economic system, our energy system, our food system, and so on. All changes will not only be good for the environment and the climate, but will also be good for equity, for working people, and for justice.
We are on an adventure to unite the stories and solutions of the pioneers, creating a better future for all. Together, we will journey to every continent, every country and community, and ask the question, what is the future you dream of? We will explore the blockers to us getting there, and we will ask, what will it take? What do we need? What do you need to create a future where we all thrive in balance and harmony with nature and each other? In this episode, we welcome human rights activist and environmentalist Kumi Naidoo. Kumi was International Executive Director of Greenpeace International from 2009 through 2015 and Secretary-General of Amnesty International. Kumi served as the Secretary-General of CIVICUS, the International Alliance for Citizen Participation, from 1998 to 2008, and he's the author of the deeply moving book, Letters to My Mother, and Can Citizen Action Save the World? Kumi's activism started as a 15-year-old boy, where he organized students in school boycotts against the apartheid regime and its educational system in South Africa. In this episode, we adventure through Kumi's love for artivism, the synergy between arts, culture, and activism, and the elements of his tireless campaigning for economic justice, gender justice, environmental justice, and climate justice. He is also very committed to intersectionality, indigenous rights, and youth rights. Kumi is a giant of a man with an open heart and kind soul. His character built through hardship, it is resilient and resolutely kind. I feel grateful for our conversation and invite you to journey with Kumi and myself. Listen to the end to hear us explore how do movements become mainstream and what Kumi's message is for a good activist, leader, and changemaker. And if you're here, that's for you. Let's get into it. Such a pleasure to be joined by Kumi Naidoo today, human rights and climate activist, and someone who's worked tirelessly for so many years fighting injustices and creating a better world. And I can't do justice to your introduction as to who you are and a little bit about you. So maybe you'd like to introduce yourself to the listener.
I'm an activist who was generated by the anti-apartheid struggle and got involved as a young 15-year-old activist in the student struggle. And I have since then been involved in struggles for economic justice, gender justice, environmental justice, and climate justice would be the main areas. But of course, I'm very committed to intersectionality. So indigenous rights and youth rights and all of that has been very much part of what I've stood up for over the decades. Right now, I mean, that journey took me through the South African NGO coalition, the adult literacy movement in South Africa, the ANC, which was then a liberation movement in South Africa led by Mandela. And then after the transition, I led the South African NGO coalition and eventually started working globally as Secretary-General of CIVICUS, World Alliance for Citizen Participation, and subsequently headed up Greenpeace and Amnesty International. I am currently working as a senior advisor to the Community Arts Network, which is seeking to promote, amongst other things, the coming together of arts, culture, and activism, which we call artivism, as a way to break through the communications challenges that activism faces. I'm also involved in a range of volunteer initiatives. The main one being the setting up of the Ricky Rick Foundation for the promotion of artivism, following the death of Ricardo, who was my son and a very popular musician, hip hop artist, and rapper. And also very involved in the community where I live in South Africa, in Johannesburg, an area called Yeoville that is in decay like many other low-income neighborhoods. And so I'm involved in quite intensive grassroots struggles at the moment because, in my neighborhood, we have not had running water for quite some time. And so there's a whole system of receiving things via tankers and so on. So, it's been quite humbling to be able to, after having served at a global level, to be able to play a very grassroots role. And as they say, all politics is local, so it's good to be back rooted in a community where I have a long history. So that's in a nutshell.
It's a perfect nutshell. And I feel humbled to connect with you. And it's interesting, the arc of your journey has been grassroots to this very large global organization and then back to your grassroots. Was there any intention around that, or did it just flow for you? Or and what were the different elements to that? Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't think I can say that it was, linear in that way. But I've been very clear, even when whatever global role I was in over the years, that home is in Africa, and this is where I will spend most of my life. And so I never took citizenship of any other country. Where I had the option to do so, in at least in Netherlands when I was at Greenpeace, in the UK when I was a student, and after that, and then in the US where I was there for 6 years. So I'm very, very rooted in my consciousness as somebody who is a product of the African continent, that I believe that Africa is the richest continent on the planet, not the poorest as we are framed. We are richest in many ways, culture, resilience, and so on. And also we are the richest continent underneath the ground, and that's precisely why we're one of the poorest continents above the ground. And so my identity is very rooted there. And all the journeys I've traveled at the global level, I always use as my reference point the struggles of the people on the African continent, which motivated me, kept me going the long hours that one needs to do in these kinds of jobs, and keep a insane travel schedule and so on.
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest, it feels like I can't really say this in the presence of you, but it feels like one of the biggest challenges that we face is our energy to keep in the fight, and that resilience that's required to be able to do that. Like I'm noticing so many people that we support and that we work with, who that is I think probably their primary challenge is just overload, so much on their shoulders, so much weight of challenge. And so frankly, it's incredible that you've kept strong and consistent through so many different transitions. And I would imagine, I just can't imagine, actually, to be honest with you. I'm in awe.
I was going to say that, one of the motivations for me was that I was surrounded by a lot of people my age that got involved in the struggle at the same time against the apartheid regime, and that died, some of them before my eyes, along the way. And when I look back, it could so easily have been me on so many different occasions. I also have a little bit of an attitude, to be honest, that I'm living on borrowed time, that, I lost so many close people. And so, like my closest friend, when we were fleeing South Africa into exile in different directions, asked me, what is the biggest contribution we can make to the cause of humanity? And I said, that's a very simple question. It's giving your life. And he said, you mean going, participating in a protest and getting shot and killed and becoming a martyr? I said, I guess so. And he said, no, it's the wrong answer. He said, it's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. Unfortunately, my friend Lenny was murdered 2 years later by the apartheid regime. And I had to think deeply about that distinction that he was making between giving your life versus giving the rest of your life. And what he was saying was something deeply profound, that the struggle for justice, economic justice, social justice, gender justice, climate justice, these struggles are not marathons. These struggles are not sprints. They are marathons. And the most important thing that we as activists, change agents, whatever we might choose to call ourselves, need to recognize that the biggest contribution we can make is to have the perseverance, the courage, the stamina, to stay true to the cause until those injustices are dislodged and alternatives are created. So we have to build within movements right now a sense of resilience, as well as people in whatever they do individually, they need to not give a victory to those that seek to oppress, dominate, and destroy. The benefit of saying, you can do all of that and you can rob me of my mental well-being as well. So right now, we should be saying we refuse to allow ourselves to veer towards despondency. In fact, to the alternative, we should be saying that this moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. In fact, the pessimism that comes from our analysis, and of course, our analysis about where the climate science says we need to be and where climate action is, which is, miles and miles apart, for example. So the pessimism from our analysis, as has been said before, can best be overcome by the optimism of our thought, our action, and so on.
Are you working to take action on climate, nature, social and sustainability goals? Then you can apply to join our community of action at futureplanet.love. Through an intentional community of your peers and subject matter experts, online and live events, and a knowledge-sharing platform, the Future Planet Community of Action empowers you to share energy and expertise, receive support, find solutions, gain the confidence to make decisions, and collaborate to have a greater impact. To discover more and apply to join, visit futureplanet.love. Right, let's get into it.
So this moment of history that we find ourselves in is one in which we need to tell ourselves very clearly and strongly that pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And that the pessimism that comes from our analysis of how deeply challenging and complex the problems we find ourselves in must be overcome by the optimism of our thought, our creativity, our action, our sense of community, and so on. And it's going to be important also to ensure that we are building community and support networks and so on for those that are having to be in the front lines, as well as in the shadows of various struggles that we are facing. When I was Secretary-General of Amnesty International, I was handing over an award to Fridays for the Future and Greta Thunberg. And in handing it over, I said, please do not allow the Donald Trumps of the world to deprive you of your childhood. It is sad that my generation has failed and that you have to do so much. But please make sure you have fun along the way, sing, dance, enjoy each other's company, and basically stay shining and stay positive, because we will be our best even in the worst of circumstances when we stay positive and stay shining. And I would be lying to you if I said that I've been able to maintain that sense of optimism that I expressed right now throughout all the different traumas that life throws one's way. But it is what we should aspire and work towards, because I think that's how we can be the best versions of ourselves, and that's how we can cope with the tremendous challenges that the current world we live in raises every single day for any thoughtful, sensitive, caring and compassionate individual.
What kept you going through those moments where you were questioning either yourself or those elements around you or the system that you were pushing against? Like, what kept you going?
The sense that the struggle for justice is a marathon and not a sprint. The sense that we might not be winning the overall war for justice, but there's important battles that we win every single day. You know, when a new group of people understand what's happening around them and wake up and smell the coffee and recognize that humanity finds itself in its most consequential decade in humanity's history, because what we choose to do in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future we'll have, or whether, in fact, our children will have a future at all. And so in that sense, you know, we have to, the stakes are high, and that's what also keeps me going. You know, the stakes are high. And like sometimes people say, hey, we think it's too late. We think we've left climate catastrophe to run too far and it's too late. So why do you still continue to fight so hard? And firstly, I don't think we should accept that. I think we should say realistically that the window of opportunity to avert the worst of catastrophic climate change, recognizing that people in the global south, including in my hometown Durban last year, where we lost 450 people in 2 days when people were hit by what they call a rain bomb. So, you know, lives are being lost on scale right now everywhere in the global south, and sometimes in the global north as well. But the sense is that there is a window of opportunity that is closing, and we must believe that human creativity, sensibility, ingenuity, capability will push that window slowly wider and wider open and give us a chance to actually make the big structural and systemic changes that we need to make to ensure that we can secure life with greater equity on the planet moving forward. So, yeah, so for all of those reasons, you know, and also the other thing I would say is, you know, activism is sexy. It's fun. It's not a drag. You don't, if you see it as a drag, you know, you must have fun in the way you engage your activism. So if you're an artist, right, don't go sit in a boring meeting where they're drafting a constitution. Take your talents and go to communities where you can work with young people to help them make murals in the community. If you're a musician, why would we want you to sit, you know, and do something other than use your talents to actually reach people and so on? So I think we need to create the highest levels of participation we've ever seen before for two reasons. One is that is what will give us the aggregated power to push against those that are resistant to change as fast as the science and the situation on the ground calls for, on the one hand, but participation on a scale where we have very, very deep civil society in range of community networks and so on is also going to be critically important for us to address the humongous challenge of well-being and mental health as climate anxiety starts to become more and more of an issue, as we see, especially amongst young people.
And climate grief as well. And as you mentioned, like genuine threats to both way of life, way of being, human existence in many parts of the world. And so my view is I see the next 7 to 10 years as a critical moment, but I also really resonate with what you're sharing around community. And I think community is the resilience that will take us beyond that moment, because the world's not going to end in 7 years. It's like at that moment, we're then going to need an even more resilient, an even more inclusive, an even more stronger bonded community where we're united in supporting each other. And I really hope we move through this moment of divisiveness that we've seen where, you know, where people, people traveling from different parts of the world to other parts of the world has been so challenging for the many that have had it so difficult, you know. And so I many other elements as well. And I really see communities being one of the ways that, you know, we want to be connecting in 30, 40, 50 years, and to say we've built another resilient community or a resilient global community. And I love the element of activism being an exciting place to be, or a place, for me, it's full of the most wonderful people, the most interesting, the most creative, the most, like, their love and their passion for a better world is just so infectious, and something that I definitely want to be surrounded by. And I couldn't think of another group of people that I would rather connect with,
Yeah, no, I want to agree with all of that, but just put a cautionary note, yeah, right?
Okay, yeah, go.
And that is, we must be careful that we recognize that progressive activism also becomes an echo chamber in itself. And that all of us who agree with each other reinforces each other's beliefs and values, just as any other echo chamber does. And we begin to sometimes imagine that there are more people with us than in reality that are supporting whatever cause that we are pursuing. And activism runs the risk of alienating itself from its base, and where people involved in movements spend disproportionate amount of time talking to each other rather than going and speaking to the people that are not yet on board. Because activism cannot be moving forward simply consolidating and organizing the people that already agree with you, right? And vilifying and alienating those that disagree with us. Real tough activism is about humbling ourselves and building the bridges to the people that are not with us, the people who voted for Trump, the people who voted for Brexit, and all of those things. And we must believe that the vision and the alternative society that we are advocating is one that is so patently just and defendable. We must believe that we can win over people who have been lied to, misled, and terrified by some of the changes that critically the science tells us we need to make in terms of changing our economic system, our energy system, our food system, and so on. All changes will not only be good for the environment and the climate, but will also be good for equity, for working people, and for justice.
Agreed, completely. And it brings up a number of different elements for me. Like, if given the option, most people would choose to either ignore what they need to be doing or feel fearful or not know what to do. And perhaps what I'm seeing a lot of is not know the most important action that they could make. Even those within the movement of people that care passionately, knowing what to do, where to do it, and how to do it is somewhat of a challenge. And so we end up looking at a system, trying to transform a system, almost asking it to change rather than being intentional. And now I'm seeing some interesting intentionality around systemic change arrive. A wonderful friend of mine, Kate at 103 Ventures, they call themselves precision activists. Catherine Howarth at Share Action in the UK is working on governance in boards. The work of Client Earth to work on legislation, like these very interesting unlocking mechanisms where you're really putting your hands into the system, which is a governance structure, which is an organizational structure, which is ultimately what we need to change, these rigid organizational structures that defend themselves. And so, like, it's great to have intention and passion and to say we need change. But my belief is we also really need to focus on those elements that are going to bring about that change with intention, and that we have enough of us that we can be systematic about unlocking systems change. So when we look at it through that lens, where do we apply that passion? What can we do to apply that passion in a way that will be more successful than we have been before?
There are a couple of things we must be willing to do in this moment, right? And we must be willing to do what Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the West African Guinea-Bissau liberation struggle, when he said, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. So where we are right now, we need a brutal analysis of why we are here. How did it get so bad? How did fascism suddenly start finding the kind of energy that is found over the last 5 years, 10 years, and so on. So, and yeah, there's no time for sort of people wondering about their personal legacies and trying to sugarcoat. You know, like when people introduce me in a nice and generous way at meetings I speak at and so on, I say, listen, that's very kind. Thank you very much. But there's another way I could introduce myself. You could have introduced me. You could have said, this guy has been around since the age of 15, fighting for economic justice, social justice, and so on. But 4 decades plus later, he has very little to show for it, right? And I'm only saying that facetiously, Because where we find ourselves right now, we have to listen to what Albert Einstein, for example, once said when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results, right? It's just not on. And so right now, part of what we need to do is also recognize that we have made a couple of errors in terms of understanding where our biggest challenges are. So, for example, most of us would have thought, and I certainly did, that the biggest challenge facing us is the repressive state apparatus, meaning the deployment of army, police, formal laws, and so on, when those who capture power are not interested in serving the majority or of doing so in a way that is respectful for future generations' rights in terms of taking care of the environment and so on. So one of the challenges is that we, as activists, feel that we need to know the answers of everything. So when you are serving an organization or movement, we often put ourselves into a pressure of like, in this turbulent, fluid, ever-changing world, that we have a fix on things and we can continue to just push for it. And what I've come to realize is needed in this current moment is much more a culture of emergence, being open to the fact that we don't necessarily know exactly where we're going to need to be 3 years, 5 years down the line. We know what the broad direction of travel is: reduce emissions, increase inequality, improve social cohesion, all of those things, right? But we can say, move to 100% renewable energy. That could be the direction of travel, but exactly how we move with a just transition in different places from where we are towards that deadline, we must create a context that those that seek change believe that they need to co-create it with the people who will be impacted by those changes, right? So we have to change the mentality of people like me standing up on a platform and creating the impression that one has somehow arrived at some version of the absolute truth. Because the truth right now is not fixed in terms of what will be the solutions moving forward. Because let's say you and I were in an organization who did a 5-year plan before the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, right? When that happened, all those strategic plans are out of the windows for any organization operating, on a transnational basis, right? Because this has impacted all of us in so many places. So the other change that we need to do, apart from having be more of less prescriptive, right? Create ways of opening, is recognizing that people are moved into action, not by you and me being brilliant with our PhDs and good theories and good analytical frames and slogans and so on, right? Because if you look at it, most of why climate activism has failed is that we do not talk a language that ordinary people can follow, right? We try to sell the climate change on facts and figures, right? 350 parts per million, 1.5 degrees, all of these things. Most of this is way above most people's kind of radar of attention, right? And so if you look at Steve Bannon and Trumpism, for example, they very consciously make a decision to forget about facts. And in fact, they make a decision to use lies aggressively, but they're not aiming here to the head, right? They are aiming here to the heart, to arouse people's passions by weaponizing hate and identity divisions and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I think has been really, really not as strong as it needs to be, I'm not saying that it's totally absent, far from it, is a very deep sense of how do we reach people's hearts? Because people are not moved by facts and figures only. In fact, they are really moved by it. So for us, in those that seeking truth to power and justice based on truth, don't have to deviate from truth. But for heaven's sake, we can learn to talk like human beings much better than we do, right? I'll give you an example of one mistake that I made, right? So I was in a little inflatable boat going on while I was at Greenpeace to go occupy a oil rig in Greenland in 2011. And I think my Greenpeace colleagues could see that I was very nervous because I don't swim very well and the waves were really, really big and rough and all that. And they said, "Oh, don't worry, Kumi, if you fall into the ocean, you'll survive, don't worry, because with what you're wearing in the Arctic freezing waters, you'll still be able to survive 2 hours," right? And I looked at the size of the waves and I thought, wow, imagine if I fell in there, the waves look so big, they might take them 2 hours to find me. And then I had this horrible thought that if this was the last action that I would ever be engaged in, right, that the slogan that I was carrying, 99.99% of the people I know, especially back home in Africa, friends, family, comrades, won't know what that slogan meant, stop Arctic destruction, because this was in 2011 when fewer people understood that the Arctic serves as a refrigerator or air conditioner of the planet. When the Arctic sea ice is not there in the summer months, that's what contributes to Arctic vortex and extreme weather events and so on. So people at that time were not seeing the connection, right? So anyway, we do the action, get arrested, spend a week in prison. Eventually, when I make it back home to South Africa a couple of weeks later, one of the kids in my family says to me, "Uncle Kumi, that was a really silly slogan, eh? Stop Arctic destruction. It meant nothing to anybody." Then I said, "What would have been a better slogan?" And she said to me, "Save Santa Claus now." And what she was saying is that you activists project your consciousness on the people that you are trying to mobilize and organize. What you need to do is understand where people's consciousness are, humble yourself, engage with it, and bring people to where you need them. And only association that people have with that part of the world in Africa, at a popular level, is that Santa Claus chills there for most of the year and makes periodic visits around Christmas, right? And I can guarantee you, if I did that action dressed as Santa Claus, the action would have been much more impactful than it actually was.
Yeah. You'd have been more easy to spot as well.
Yeah, so I'm saying that we need to address that. The next thing we need to address is also us as activism making the error of mistaking access for influence, because we have spent too much of time engaging with those with power at the top in the hope that that access that we got would deliver results. And, we did so in good faith. I am probably somebody who's most guilty of this, multiple meetings with heads of UN, World Bank, so on, heads of state, ministers, and so on, in good faith, trying to get them to do the right thing. And now when I look back and reflect more closely, that many, if not most of those engagements were very ritualistic and formulaic. They knew exactly what I was going to say. I knew exactly what they're going to say. I knew more or less where we're going to land. They knew more or less where we're going to land. They went through a process where they could tick off a box saying civil society engaged and consulted with. We went back and ticked off a box saying government lobbied and advocated upon, right?
This is one of the biggest challenges. And it goes back to what you were saying. Sorry to interrupt, but it goes back to what you were saying as well around like being brutally honest with what we're communicating and also I think what we're doing in that moment. And I'm one of the things I'm so interested in is what is the energy of that moment? What are we doing in that moment? How are we being? How are we acting? How are we doing? The challenge of looking like you're doing enough is a big, big blocker to actual change happening. If it's with reporting, if it's with all these, if it's talking at an event and saying how good you're doing. I was at an event the other day where, on the same day that we get these startling graphics showing just how little is being achieved and how much people have got targets versus actual action or reduction. And on the same stages, we have the leaders of organizations standing up and going, "We're doing great. Everything's going well. We're doing so good over here." And it's just such a blocker to change, to not be real with where you're at and not be honest about where you're at and not be even vulnerable about where you're at and say, I don't know, it's such a big thing, that thing.
No, absolutely. Let's stay with that blockers of change, right? Because that point, that observation that you just make points to one of the biggest blockers of change, which is cognitive dissonance, right? Where all the facts are facing us in our face, right? Because basically people in the most vulnerable parts of the world have been chanting right up to 2015, 1.5 to stay alive. And By the end of 2015, they already started shouting 1.5, we might survive. And we're already at 1.2 virtually, right? And we're already seeing such extreme weather events, right? And so, largely, even civil society, even the leaders of the environmental movement, we all continue with a business as usual approach to a large extent, right? And so unless we can break through that denial of the reality of how close to the cliff of the point of no return we might be, and that our options are closing. And let's be blunt about it. Why is there so much of cognitive dissonance in the world? And I'm going to, this might sound like an off-ball comment, but let me be very clear. Systemic racism is a very, very big part of it, right? How do I get there? Because, we talk about climate injustice, the need for climate justice, but the reality is we're facing a problem of climate apartheid, right? We're very comfortable these days, unlike in the past, to talk about the global north and the global south, to recognize the differences and the colonial histories and so on. Not that it's recognized to its fullest sense, but the reality is, when we say global south, we're talking about the global majority. When we say global north, we're talking about the global minority, right? You look at our movements, who dominates discourse. You look at all our high-profile international NGOs, including two of whom I have led, Greenpeace and Amnesty, right? They do not reflect anything like what the world looks like. When we say INGOs are structurally racist, what we mean is that if you look at who holds power and who holds the cultural power of deciding what is the right thing to do and so on, it's very clear people from a particular part of the world. And so that when I say cognitive dissonance, it's also about failing to recognize it. In fact, to be honest, the governance of many of the international NGOs at one point, less than 10 years ago, was just as bad as the governance of the World Bank or the IMF was. The whole notion of $1, one vote kind of governance systems and so on. So some of my colleagues in some of the movements will feel that I'm being too harsh. But let me say to them from the bottom of my heart, as somebody who tried really hard to contribute to international NGOs, which always started in the global north by the global minority, to make them more global, to make them more fit for purpose, and tried really hard in the belief that the best that the global north was to offer was to be found in movements like some of which I've spoken about. And then we find actually there's such a resistance to make the internal cultural change to fully embrace what is now fashionably called JEDI principle, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, in our work. Because as it's been said by Gandhi and others, we should be the change we want to see in the world. And if we continue to deny the fact that we actually replicate the same power structures, the same ways in which the inequality in the world looks like we see that finding itself in our movements, then we've got a serious problem.
So one question I want to ask is how do we move past that? But I'm also there's two common themes that we're working with here. One is a way of being, a way of feeling, a way of showing up, a way of feeling, a heart-centered way of feeling, acting, and being, which is really the heart of everything. Like if we can orientate ourselves to be truly in our best selves, in a thriving mindset, and in a mindset which is inclusive, which is the way that we want to the way that we would imagine we want to show up in the world and act in that way. That's part of it. The other part of it is this sort of inappropriate appropriation of everything that we want to do. So you talked about activists. We talked about having access. We talk about now we're seeing it with nature as well. We saw it with carbon footprinting, for example, where actually these things get taken into the system of organizational structure. And rather than for that system to truly open its arms wide and allow itself to be transformed, it sort of changes it to be something that's acceptable for it. And as a result, you end up with this very pale imitation of the change that you wish to see. And in fact, if anything, it's a massive blocker to that change, because you spend all that time thinking, oh, it's happened, it's done, we've done it, we've made it. And then you get like 10 years later and you realize, fuck it, no, it just didn't happen. It's just that cultural shift, which really requires us to
to be open, to be willing to let go of the things we're holding on to now to receive that future. How does that happen? Why hasn't that happened? I'd love to explore that a bit more. I'm curious about that, right? Like that's...
I think it's partly how powerful the logic is. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't know, right? I think people are so resistant to uncertainty and change in their personal lives as well as in broader society, unless things get really bad. Like, and if you take an example of somebody who ends up suffering from addiction, right? Until it gets really, really bad and they admit and seek help, it's a very difficult set of activities and life they're leading, right? And one of the things we can draw an analogy of the moment we're in, our addiction to fossil fuels now has got so bad, and that you can see the consequences are so bad, that I think we are seeing a level of willingness to want to get involved and want to make a difference and want to stand up for children and people's grandchildren's futures, that I am seeing a level of energy, participation, and mobilization that I've not seen in more than 4 decades of activism. And that's on the positive side. On the negative side, I think we must be honest that the convergence of crises that we are seeing means that we are really, really struggling, right? In the sense that we see setbacks on reproductive rights in the United States. We see, moves towards nationalistic tendencies with Brexit, and the list is very, very long, right? And the climate crisis, which should be the sort of thing that shakes us into our kind of reality, we don't seem to be able to do that. But it's also a question of, whether people are hearing and seeing change that they can believe in, right? And because a lot of the change that people are talking about, even many NGOs actually, it's really about rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic while humanity sinks, right? Because if you look at what our response was to the global financial crisis, say, in 2008 or previous crises before, it was all about system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance. But what was needed then, and is even more urgently needed now, is system innovation, system transformation, and system redesign, right? So we have completely the wrong mindset coming from our governments and the dominant business interests.
Yeah, where for them it's about maintaining as much as possible status quo. So this thing really landed with me as well before, and I've noticed this a bit actually, the marginalization of movements and how we bring them into the mainstream. You sort of touched on it before. It's, even with Greta, like they have these candle moments where suddenly the world illuminates to them, and it's happening in degrowth now as well, and it's happening around other common themes where we're seeing it. It happened in justice last year around Black Lives Matters, right? It happened, like these things happen. It's probably happened in different ways in different places. Like these things arrive like a flash. They become popular. People work out how to make sense of it. Some people are for it. Some people are against it. Some people use it. Some people support it. And then it just becomes a piece of the furniture in a way. Like it becomes a part of how we move. But often it doesn't click through into fully transformational change. Like it'll just be like, oh, okay, great. Now we know that some people are vegan and most people still aren't, for example, mindful about what they eat in terms of meat and those things. It's happened on so many of these elements. How do we move past that? Like, how do movements become mainstream? How does that happen? Is it multiple bits of? My sense is it's never straight. As you mentioned before, it's never a straight line. But what are some of the components that would make it move more into the mainstream?
Well, the difficulty we have is, the ideological state apparatus by which we mean the framework for education, funding of arts and culture, and so on. Those that actually inform people's opinions, right? These are all heavily stacked against us, right? And you would think that given how bad the climate crisis is, that every other day you would be having one voice that is saying, it's urgent, we need to act, time is running out. you don't have that. Maybe the day when the IPCC report comes out saying that we are on the road to on a suicidal trajectory, then there's 48 hours of reporting, oh, we're on a suicidal trajectory, things are looking really bad, and then after that it's business as usual. So this is also our inability and part of how you move people. What do you move? How do you get people to move? And that is why I'm really, after all these decades, spending most of my time now promoting this whole notion of artivism, right? Which is saying we need to think about arts and culture and how arts and culture connects with people in their everyday lives, in their bathrooms, in their communities, in the churches, in the workplaces, in the mines, and so on. Understand that culture and infuse with that culture messages of hope, different visions of the future, and the pathways to which you can get there. And if you think about it, with so many people in the world, firstly, who are basically not able to read and write because they were educationally disenfranchised, and then add to that the number of people who might be educated but don't have access to technology and all the new sort of completely marginalized from the so-called information superhighway, right? And when you have people having those limitations of access to information and so on, in that kind of context emerges a Bolsonaro or emerges a Trump with a xenophobic and a very othering kind of narrative, right? And suddenly, because there's no pathways of hope that are available to people, and then we ourselves start being very, very sort of, pessimistic in the way that we talk about things and so on. So I'm going to try something. I've never done this on a podcast before, right? But let's try, and if I can share with you a screen.
So on that, whilst you figure out that bit, I agree with you. I think the pathways to hope, that sort of, and culture and community are soft, heart-centered. There's sort of a sense of feeling that you're right. A lot of people, perhaps if they're, I don't want to put words in your mouth, perhaps if they feel disenfranchised or drawn to other forms of movements or drawn to fear, culture and community are home spaces where you can feel a sense of connection. I think the attention for me is moving from the head to the heart and knowing that a future that we want to be in is much more heart-centered and much more a sense of community, and it'll be built by all of us coming into connection in community and supporting each other and supporting those around us. But also what's almost being pulled apart, because the crisis that we find ourselves in forces us to be in our heads. And I think that's a real tension, a real challenge to try and hold those two truths together, because perhaps, that's a tension I find really challenging to hold, actually. And I haven't found the right way to solve that yet, or even if I would need to, but I'm going to try and help you share your screen now.
So part of our limitation has been not to create an enabling environment for people of a range of different inclinations and different skills and talents to be able to contribute in different ways, right? And what this infographic on the screen shows is just because, see, one of the unintended things that seems to have happened is that because quite often activism, and particularly, I would say, more mainstream NGOism, starts from a point of how people are oppressed, exploited, marginalized, repressed, and so on. And I think what happens sometimes is that unwittingly, especially with folks in the global south who are acting in the global, from the global north acting in the global south, they tend to start imagining that people have much less capacity and agency than they still actually have, even after slavery, colonialism, and all the other things that they've been through, right? And so what I was trying to do here is to try to remind ourselves that actually people have amazing resilience and amazing agency. If you just look at how people survived during COVID, the poorest of communities, they struggled, they cried, they buried the dead, they were in pain, but they survived to a large extent, and then, against immense painful odds, right? But if we are going to move forward, we need to try to think about how we harness all of people's talents, inclinations, abilities, and so on. So what I've done here is each of the circles in the quadrants, you start reading them from the inside, reminding ourselves people have power as, and then on the harnessing autonomy one as citizens and voters, litigators, builders of movements, volunteers, and so on. Importantly, the bottom left-hand quadrant, people have power as when they harness our creative participation. This is critically important here, including the need for us to be more respectful of indigenous and ancient wisdoms that colonialism tried to wipe out, but still, thankfully, have still, survived, especially bodies of knowledge about how we should live together with, in a mutually dependent relationship with nature. The last thing I'll quickly say is we should not underestimate the fact that we have a lot of power in terms of our consumptive power, and how we harness that power can make a huge difference to bringing down, not just corporations, can bring down countries if we get capability to do it well when corrupt political elites take over in certain places. And then our wealth, when we aggregate our wealth, maybe each of us, when a bank wants to fund a fossil fuel project, as was the case in Australia in 2015, and people mobilized against all the banks saying, thou shalt not lend to this project. All banks in the end said they wouldn't lend it and slow down the project considerably and so on. So yes, individually we might have little money, but when we can harness our collective power, it is much more powerful than we think. So we have much more power than we are harnessing in the current moment. And for me, that is an optimistic thing, because if we harness everything, deploy it more creatively, more equitably, more courageously, I want to believe that we still have a chance to reverse things and secure a planet which is livable with greater equity and peace for our children and their children.
That's perfect. There's always a moment when you know that you've reached the end of this moment in time. And I feel like this is that moment. Not because there isn't more to say, not because you don't have a deeper, wider, greater story, but because that's it, right? You've summarized, quite clearly. And there's so much more that I'd love to connect with you on. And just because I've decided that might be it, doesn't mean that you may feel like you've shared everything. Do you feel like there's more that you would like to share, or something that you didn't share that you would like to share?
In answer to one of your questions of what do we do, what is to be done? And I think we need to recognize that another missing link has been we have not been as intersectional in our thinking and in our action as we need to. And that moving forward, we must turbocharge sectionality. We really need to turbocharge sectionality, everything we do.
Agreed. And so bringing back what we drew on before was mistaking access for influence, which was something that you mentioned, which I agree with. How do we bring intersectionality in a way that is equitable, that truly puts the people that we look to welcome first, and rather than just giving them a voice, empowers them and also enables all people to act in a way that's aligned with views that are intersectional?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sadly, we missed a lot of opportunities when we don't see the intersectionality of the issues that we are trying to address, because for people who are facing them, they don't see them as separate issues. They don't say, well, okay, today I need Amnesty International to come and take care of my human rights, and tomorrow I need Greenpeace to come and take care of my environmental concerns, and then the following day I need Oxfam to come and take care of my development challenges. People live intersectional lives, and our organizations and our leaders and our thinkers and actors must be more intersectional. Then the last thing I would say is that this moment also calls for what I've previously framed as a billion acts of courage, right? We need to recognize that unlike other moments in history where we've had to deal with colonialism, slavery, and much more, what is different about the moment we are in is that the climate struggle puts something at the center of the table that is terrifying. And that is, it puts a clock, right? Whereas, you you can say on gender equality, it's pathetic that we have the level of progress we have, given how much of sacrifice and struggle we have seen towards the goal of achieving full gender equity. But there is no clock that's ticking that's saying you have to sort gender equity by a certain time. With climate, there's a clock that's, at the center of the table. And therefore, we must be willing to analyze our situation in ways that are more courageous than we've been able to do in the past, even if it makes us, you and me, part of the problem, right? And so I would like to end by saying, at a time when most of us feel that COVID is the worst disease humanity faces, I think we need to be honest that it's not COVID, it's not influenza, it's not even HIV/AIDS that caused such devastation, but it's a disease we could call affluenza. Right? Affluenza is a pathological illness where we've been led to believe that a good, meaningful, decent, prosperous, happy life comes from more and more and more material acquisitions. And with that, we also come to believe that the level of inequality can be as obscene and as outrageous as it is in the world. And what we need in this moment is a spirit of what Martin Luther King called creative maladjustment, right? Speaking in 1965, when I was about a couple of months old, he said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted." Now, all of us want to suffer from, all of us want to be well adjusted and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well adjusted to. So then he goes on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination." And on the economy, he says, "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many and give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society." Now, if that was relevant to the United States in 1965, when I was a couple of months old, it is substantially more relevant not only to the United States, but to every single country in the world. In a longer version of the speech, he says, "I call upon decent men and women around the world to come together to set up a new international organization that was never set up. And I don't think we need to set it up, provided everybody starts taking the logic." And he said that that organization should be known as the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. So my message is, a good activist, a good leader, a good changemaker must be ones who are creatively maladjusted, who believe that the status quo is so deeply, horrifically broken that only with bold thinking and a courage to make big change quickly can we actually secure the future for our children and their children. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. What a pleasure. I feel momentarily full, and perhaps with a lifetime of this moment. So thank you. I appreciate you. I look forward to hopefully growing our connection over time and supporting you with anything that you feel that you need, although I feel I am only small and you are, but together with you.
No. So please, absolutely. I was going to say that. Keep in touch. Let us know what you're doing. Let us know if we can help. And if you can help with the things that we are doing, we'd welcome that.
Happy to be an ally. Thanks, Kumi.
Please like, rate and share this widely on your social channels. The more people that we can welcome to join us on the journey and support the changemakers we champion, the faster we can combat climate change, battle biodiversity loss, and co-create a future we can all love. Where do we go next? What questions did this spark for you? Would you like to know more about a particular topic? Who shall we adventure to? What shall we ask them? Where shall we go? What shall we build? How shall we do this together? Do you have any questions or comments? Join the Future Planet community of action at futureplanet.love to sign in, sign up, and get involved. Together, we can.